This is Duke University.
Hi, I'm Jonathon Cummings from the Fuqua School of Business. I'm a professor in the management and organizations area. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about coordination challenges in innovation teams. So innovation is a topic that is quite popular in organizations today. Innovation can range from incremental innovation, where people are coming up with minor product improvements, to radical innovation, where they're coming up with new products or services entirely. Innovation is often separated into the generation of ideas, the creativity, how people come up with new products and services. And it also includes the implementation of these ideas. How is it that you roll it out? How is it that you put a team together to solve the problem and come up with a new solution? My research primarily focuses on the implementation part. So I'm interested in how it is that these teams come together to deliver this new idea or this new innovation. The area of innovation has a lot of researchers in strategy and economics and finance and marketing. So innovation really is relevant to lots of particular disciplines. In the management of innovation, so those that study how innovation is managed, we're in particular interested in the coordination, the dynamics of how teams work together, how it is that members bring their expertise and knowledge from different areas, and how is it that those teams can then turn an idea into an actual product. So let me talk to you a little bit about some of the coordination challenges, some of the issues that teams working on these innovation projects face. Two issues in particular that my research is focused on is one, the time zones that people are in. So imagine you're in a Fortune 500 company and you have people in the US and India and China. How is it that those teams can really work together in a way that's synchronous, that the flow is good, that people feel like they're able to work together cohesively? And the second issue that I've focused a lot on is the membership that teams have to create. So some teams have members who are full-time, devoted and dedicated to that team. Other teams have members who are part-time or temporary or who maybe work just a couple hours of that team. So when you have teams with membership that varies, you also encounter some of these coordination problems that organizations have. So let me read you a quick example from an interview quote from one of the people working on one of these global innovation teams. He says, "One of the problems that we have when working with people that are 8 hours away in time zones is the coordination of large projects. The engineers need to work together to talk through problems. So when there are significant time differences, they just can't make good, solid progress without being able to talk. So what we started to do in the last couple of years is starting to divide up the project where each site has a completely separate job with some minor overlap with the other sites. But in general, they have one complete section of the project all to their own. Otherwise, what we found is trying to manage one functionality across multiple sites is that people were having to work a ridiculous number of hours in order to maintain that communication." So as you see in this quote, the team member is really struggling to understand what the best way to organize the project is. How do you divide up the work? How do you give different people on the project pieces to work on? And then how do you synchronize or coordinate the handoff of pieces of the work from one place to another? And so this gives you a sense of some of the coordination challenges that these distributed, geographically dispersed teams face in organizations. Let me go into a little bit more detail about the difference between what I'm calling space and time, where space refers to the geographic distance between people, so how many miles or kilometers are people separated, versus time, which is really the overlap in the number of hours that you work in a workday. So if you think about a team distributed in the United States from the West Coast to the East Coast, they have a few time zone differences, so they might have 4 depending on where they're working, which is very different than a team that's working in Europe and South Africa, where they don't really have many time zone differences, but they have many miles separating them. So before we get into a field studies where I can really illustrate some of these challenges, I just want to clarify what the implications of time separation really are. So I have 3 teams to give you an example. Team number 1 has 2 time zones between New York and Singapore, 3 members in New York, 4 members in Singapore. They have a maximum time zone span of 11 hours. So those 2 sites are separated from 11 hours. So if you're working from 8 to 5 in both locations, you actually have no overlap in your work hours. So somebody from Singapore is going to have to come in early, someone from New York is going to have to stay late to negotiate those time zone differences. Team number 2, on the other hand, has 4 time zones, and their maximum time zone span is 8. So they're separated by London, Bangalore, Moscow, and Beijing. So if they're working in a normal, again, 8 to 5 workday, some members of each of these sites are going to have an opportunity to interact synchronously. They're going to be in the same time in which they can talk and solve problems. And in this particular case, they're separated across 4 sites, whereas again, team number 1 is separated across 2 sites. And finally, team number 3 has 6 time zones. So there are between Anchorage, Denver, Mexico, La Paz, New York, Buenos Aires. So even though there's more sites, so here in this particular team 3, you have 6 sites. Again, team 2, you have 4 sites. Team 1, you have 2 sites. You actually have the least number of time zone spans. So here, during a normal workday, 8 to 5, people are going to have overlap. So reflect for a minute about these different configurations, what the challenges are of having people at more sites versus people at more time zones versus people who are clustered or in subgroups at different time zones. So you can imagine, as someone who designs these innovation teams to come up with new products or services across different locations, how it is that they come up with the optimal configuration. How is it that they determine how many people from each location do we need? Now, the number one reason that managers report to me when I've done interviews in the past for having these globally distributed teams is knowledge and expertise. All of the people are often not located in the same place. So if you're working on a very technical project that requires specific expertise, you need to reach out to other areas in the company to get this expertise. You're not going to relocate everybody to the same place every time there's a new project. And so sometimes it's out of your control. Sometimes you can't really determine who's going to be on a project in a particular location. So let me talk about a field study. Let me describe for you how I would go out into the field, work with a company, study this particular problem of coordination challenges. And so the question that this organization was interested in is how to organize for this type of collaboration, how to put people together on a team that maximizes the expertise that they bring, but minimizes some of the challenges, some of the coordination problems. And so what are some of these obstacles to success? What are the obstacles to teams being able to come up with a new idea in the shortest amount of time? And then finally, when you're distributed, what are some of the issues that you might face that are different than a traditional co-located team? And so the study typically starts off with a set of interviews, talking with senior managers about their strategy, what are they trying to get out of their program for innovation, what are they trying to achieve or accomplish. And then it involves talking to some of the project managers themselves. So in this particular case, we did about 25 interviews with project leaders of these development teams trying to come up with new ideas and implement solutions to problems. And once we had those interviews, we got a good sense of the context, what it's like in that organization to work on these types of tasks. And so from that point, we developed a survey of 123 of these teams. Over 1,000 members participated in the survey, completed questions about the nature of the project, the type of work they're doing, what was their role in the project, who they interacted with, the technologies they used, and most importantly, the coordination challenges that they faced. And then once the survey was done, we had managers and other leaders in the organization assess these projects. How successful were they? Did they complete it on time? Did they implement their new ideas? Were customers satisfied? Were the products generally a success? So once we had the interviews with senior managers, the interviews with project managers, the surveys were completed, we needed to collect some control variables. We needed to identify some factors that should influence the success of these teams. And so team size is often a variable that comes up as an important factor because having fewer people, you can do less stuff, but having more people requires more coordination. There's room for slippage and for people not handing stuff off effectively and for people not knowing what other members are doing. So as the team gets larger, it becomes increasingly difficult to manage the work. The second thing, of course, is distance. So since it's a study of geography and where people are located, we wanted to make sure and really measure carefully where people are. Are they in the same room, the same hallway, a different floor, different building, different city, different country, and so on, so that we know the distance between each pair of members on the team. And then finally, teams can be more successful if they have more resources. So to what extent did they get the budget they needed? What extent did they get the people that they needed? To what extent was their project a priority? Did it have urgency? Did it require immediate feedback? So these are the types of variables. There's more as well, but I just wanted to give a flavor of what you need to take into account when you're studying these types of teams and organizations. And so here's this time zone span. And so just really to make sure that everybody understands what is being measured, we take the distance between two people who are furthest apart. So in this particular case, we had someone from Santa Clara, we had someone from Bangalore. If you go from west to east, you see that the distance between those two sites is 13 and a half time zones. So for each team, we're going to calculate the furthest distance apart in terms of time zones for every pair of members. And so the lowest common denominator is the furthest away any two people are on the team in terms of time zones. And that's what really we focused on in this particular study. So once we measured the time zones, once we knew how far apart people were, and as I mentioned in the survey, we also measured the extent to which where their offices were physically located. Then in the survey, we actually asked people about the coordination problems that they faced. And so here's a list. Replanning things because of missed delivery dates, problems due to non-adherence, priority conflicts, escalating things to a higher level, roadblocks, redundancy, integration problems, rework. So these are all the types of things that projects face when they're trying to solve their problems and come up with their ideas. And so we made sure to ask each member of the team to what extent do they experience these coordination problems. And then what we did is we took the measure of coordination problems and we correlated it with, or we ran regression models to understand its relationship with both the time zone differences as well as the performance of these teams. And so there's two charts I want to show you. The first chart shows a direct relationship between having more time zones and your team performing better or worse. And what we found is a direct negative relationship between having greater time zone span, again, remember Santa Clara to Bangalore, that large time zone span on average resulted in worse performance. So those teams that were very distributed had lower performance ratings on average by the managers and the project leaders in the organization. However, the second chart, you see that once we take into account these coordination problems, so once in the regression model we include this measure of all of the different challenges and problems that they faced, we see that that direct negative relationship disappears. So no longer is having a maximum time zone span associated directly with performance, but rather having more time zones is associated with more problems. And in turn, these more coordination problems are associated with worse team performance. So if you think about time zone spans and their direct relationship, and you don't measure the coordination challenges, you might think that all teams across multiple time zones are going to perform poorly. But that's not true. What is true is that teams across time zones are going to have these coordination problems, and those coordination problems in turn make it more difficult to be successful. And so really trying to understand how do you minimize these coordination problems can allow teams across different time zones to be more effective. So let me talk about a few ways that organizations might reduce these coordination problems. And again, these come from the interviews, they come from the academic literature. And there tends to be these two categories. One category is called task organization. So how do you assign roles? How do you come up with your goals and strategies for your team? How do you distribute responsibilities? How do you establish ground rules for working together? So task organization really characterizes the processes and practices in your global team. How is it that you're going to work together to come up with a new innovative solution to problems that you or your customers are facing? The second really deals with communication tools. So to what extent are you using voice communication? To what extent are you using text messages or instant messaging platforms or chats or other ways to interact synchronously? To what extent are you using email? To what extent are you using video tools such as WebEx or NetMeeting or other platforms for communicating? And so when you distinguish between task organization, which is how you set up the team to work, from the communication tools, which characterize to what extent you're actually communicating, you can start to think of these levers that managers can pull to help these teams. And so the question is whether task organization or communication tools reduce the coordination problems in these teams. So why don't you pause for a second and think about your own organizations and ask yourself, in your organization, what might be more effective? Making sure there's good ground rules and there's ways for people to decide who does what, or to have suites of communication tools available at their disposal so they can really work together effectively. So here's what we found. To be blunt, task organization did a really good job of reducing these coordination problems. Communication tools, not so much. So what we found is that teams that were better structured, that they were clear about responsibilities, that they divided up who did what, those teams were much more successful at reducing these coordination problems. However, teams that had more tools available, people used the tools more often, they really could decide what they wanted to use, again, voice, video, email, chat, and so on. All the tools in the world did not make a difference for these globally distributed teams that were facing these coordination challenges. So a really key management implication is to think about how do you set up these teams to work effectively together, not just give them a tool and say, go off and communicate and work together. You really have to think carefully about who's doing what, how to structure the work, what responsibilities people have, and so on, because that, in this particular study, shows much more effectiveness than the communication tools themselves. And so to summarize, these coordination problems really did explain the negative relationship between being distributed across many time zones and performance for these teams. And so it's, again, important to think about being separated by space or being separated by time in and of themselves are not going to result in poor performance or the lack of implementation of particular new ideas, but rather thinking about how space and time result in particular challenges that the team face is really what's going on behind the scenes here. And as I just noted, task organization, how you set up the team, was much more effective in this particular study than the communication tools for solving these coordination problems in these hardware or software teams. So let me talk about a few implications before I wrap up. So the first implication is think carefully about how you want to break up and put your team members into subgroups. And so if you're spread across 9 or more time zones, then you have to think about dividing up these teams so that you really reduce the time zone span to get under 9 time zone hours. And that's really where the divide typically comes in an organization, again, if you're working from 8 to 5, whether you work late or come in early. And so if you think strategically about how to divide up those teams, so for example, if you're in Bangalore and you're in Santa Clara, maybe if the expertise is available, you have some team members in London or in Europe somewhere, so that you can better divide up or bridge that separation from California to India with someone in between. And so the handoffs, the transitions, passing ideas along, getting feedback, and so on is going to be much more effective if people don't have to do too much work late at night or too much work early in the morning. The second implication, and this really has to do with the use of communication tools, is thinking about people's habits, people's patterns. If they want to do email for everything, they're going to run into this risk of not selecting other media for tasks that are more complicated or more challenging or need voice or need video or need other ways to communicate. And so when you're separated by time zone and every minute matters that you have overlap because if an urgent problem comes up and you need to pick up the phone and call somebody, you want to make sure that you really have that opportunity for synchronous communication. So to what extent can these communication tools build in these extra features to support task organization? So what if when you went and logged into your console, it didn't just ask whether you want to use email or call somebody on Skype or have a video conference, but rather if it said, here are what the people on your team are working on. Here's the due date of your next deliverable. Here's who you have to pass your work on to next, who you're going to hand it off with. So if you have a better sense of planning and thinking ahead about what parts of the task need to become important or prioritized, you can do a better job of selecting the tools you want to use to communicate, as well as coordinating your work more effectively. So thinking about ways that communication tools can embed or add some of these task organization strategies will really help you in working in these global teams. And so finally, to wrap up, I want you to think about what types of questions you have for our discussion. What types of issues are you facing? Are they time zone issues? Are they geographic distribution issues? I've looked in other work at cultural issues. What is it that differs from country to country? How is it that members work on these multiple teams? And what happens when they don't work full-time on a single team? These are just a few of the coordination challenges that come up when global organizations are really trying to innovate, really trying to come up with new ideas. And in particular, why the implementation part of this global innovation teaming is a particular challenge when organizations are geographically and temporally dispersed. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.